Heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present, and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So, does anybody have any questions from last week? You got all the history down, right? You know the lives of all those saints we talked about? Okay. So what I wanted to talk about today is, some of the underlying context of monastic thought that is the basis for this, for the Ladder of Divine Ascent, and then look at the various forms of monastic life as they developed, which are very much mentioned in the book, so that you can kind of contextualize what they were doing. First and foremost, what is monastic life? But to quote Saint Ignatiy Bryancheninov, who was one of the greatest Russian monastic writers of the 19th century, it's all about living according to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Life according to the gospel, life according to the scriptures, life in obedience to the scriptures, and trying to conform oneself to the ideals that are set forth in the scriptures, and that any monastic life that is divorced from the scriptural idea is not legitimate. And there have been all sorts of different times in history when things have just kind of spun off into all sorts of weird things, and they still do. But for the most part, institutional monasticism, as it's developed since the beginning of the 4th century, has very much embodied these ideals of life according to the Gospels. And when I say the Gospel, it refers not just to the 4 Gospels, it means to the New Testament, and to really take the New Testament seriously. So, for example, when Saint Anthony was a young man, his parents had died. He was wondering what to do. He went to church and he heard the gospel reading, "Go and sell all you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." So he was managing his parents' estate. He put his sister for safe, in a convent to be raised with to grow up with the nuns. Whatever she did was her business ultimately, as it is for any of us. And he sold all the stuff, probably gave some endowment to the convent, and then he went off into a life of solitary asceticism. And throughout the history of the church, you have people aspiring to this. Now we just read the gospel. The rich young man comes to Jesus and said, "What do I need to do to be saved?" And Jesus tells him the commandments. And he said, "Well, I've done all of this from my youth." And Jesus says, "If you wish to be perfect, go sell all you have," and so forth. And it's that seeking after perfection in the spiritual life that is what monasticism is all about. It's about creating a context in which every aspect of life builds on the search for spiritual life, on the attempt to learn how to control one's thoughts, to live a life of chastity, to live a life of non-acquisition. In the Orthodox understanding, the West calls it poverty, we call it life of non-acquisition, and to live a life in a context to obedience, so that by obeying an earthly elder, that obedience becomes obeying the elder for the sake of God, that obedience becomes an obedience to God. And so that puts tremendous responsibility on the elder as well as on the person living the life of obedience. And I'll get into that elder discipleship relationship, because really, if monasticism is anything, it's the sacrament of obedience. Because monasticism is really defined as obedience. Now, the word monasticism comes from the Greek word monos, alone, or monachos. But what's kind of funny, and for most people in the monastic life, and it's identical for men and women. Even the clothes are identical. The women's cut is a little different than men's cut, but otherwise they're virtually identical. And in a sense, there is, as St. Paul says, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. And thus it's that unity and that life in transcendence of our gender, because to live the life of the monk is to live the life of the angels. And so there's a very ancient kind of idea that the monastics live the angelic life, and so in which there is neither male nor female. There are only persons. Now that has a very interesting history to it, and I can go back on that. So when I refer to monasticism, monastic life, or monks, that's both male and female. Part of that is that it's an eschatological sign. Monasticism is a revelation and a participation of the life of the kingdom, on one hand. On the other hand, it's very regular daily life, with a few twists like hours of services and prayer rules and things like that. But otherwise, it's daily life. I mean, you have to do the same things in a monastery you do in a family. I mean, you still have to go to the store. You still have to shop. You still have to cook. You have to, you have to work. You have to all these things. But on the other hand, it's life transformed, and what transforms it is a life that completely revolves around the common search for communion with God, and for the living experience of unity with God, of constant so that we can attain to the constant, unbroken, conscious perception or awareness of God. In the words of St. Simon the New Theologian, which is what salvation is. And it becomes, and since that is what salvation is, that's what the kingdom of heaven is. And that it's possible here in this life, in this world. And so a monastery is the context. It's a kind of, I hate to call it institutional context, but it is. It's a kind of institutional context that is completely focused on salvation, and the essential ideas underlying it are repentance and transformation, and communion with God, and obedience, and all of these. And in other words, it's a life of the virtues. So to live according to the virtues, and to be able to put the passions away, and to let them go and not be attached. It's a life it's a life that is not of this world, we're in the world, but not of the world. We're in the world because we're still living on this biological existence on this, but we're not of the world. And the world in the scriptural sense, St. John, for example, in the second epistle talks, do not love the world or the things of the world, for all that is in the world is the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh and the pride of life. St. James says, if you make yourself a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. If you would be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. And so this ascetic sense of what the world means, it doesn't it's not about technology, it's not about human society, but it's about that context of relationships which are defined by the passions. And the monastery is a different kind of set of relationships that are not defined by our passions, that are defined by, hopefully, by authentic Christian love, which is noetic and not emotional, which is on one hand, it's a voluntary union. On the other hand, it's the manifestation of our union with one another in Christ, and thus, like marriage, it's an eschatological sign that as the community of marriage is a little church, and thus is manifests the kingdom of God, so also a monastic community. But a monastic community tends to be much larger than even a marriage with lots of kids. And it's also multi-generational, it's also it can be multi-ethnic, it can be multicultural, multilingual, and so forth. And monasticism, and the thing about one of the important things about monasticism, and you see this actualized on places like Mount Athos, the Holy Mountain, is that it transcends ethnic barriers. Now, the monasteries individual monasteries tend to be actually on the Holy Mountain, people from one or another village on one or another particular island. Or somewhere in Greece. On the other hand, you put everybody together and you've got all these various places in Greece, plus Russians and Romanians and Bulgarians, and you had Georgians. At one time there was a Latin monastery on Mount Athos, a Benedictine monastery, with the full Benedictine cycle and Gregorian chant and everything in Latin. Of course, that didn't survive much past the Crusades. But it was all, and Mount Athos has always been multi-ethnic, and now you have the entire spectrum from black to white, from Finns to Africans, and everything in between, and of course the whole Asian mix. You have people from all different ethnic communities. Now, Mount Athos, the language is Greek, unless you're in a Russian monastery where it's Russian. The Romanian monastery, it's Romanian. But everybody gets along, except the common language is Greek. Monasticism, in a sense, represents the highest striving of the Christian ideal. And that's intentional, that it strives to actualize all the potential of it's all the idealism of Christianity is in the monastic community, of that life according to the gospel, of that authentically Catholic vision of the church and of reality, which includes everybody regardless of where they're from or what and united in a common vision, a common life, a common faith, and living in a relationship of love. Now, boys will be boys and boys will fight. But for the most part, that's something very uncommon. But I mean, we're still fallen people. And so what monasticism becomes is actually a context for people to attain to maturity. Now, they get boys who go there with two hairs sticking out of their chin. They're not supposed to go there if they don't have any kind of beard. So, you start growing a beard. But otherwise, people, literally, they get teenagers who come and who don't, who are not in any way mature, and who find there the kind of fatherly guidance and protection and love and nurturing in a fatherly way that they might otherwise get in the world, but working not only on their psychological and intellectual maturity, but on their spiritual maturity. And what is that spiritual maturity? It's precisely all about learning to get, well, in the first place, it's about getting over yourself. Getting over yourself. And bringing yourself under control. It's about bringing the passions under control. And learning how to control your mind. And learning how to pray undisturbed by thoughts. That's a big order, and it takes time. But if you're raised in that kind of a context, now on Athos they only take men after they've begun to develop, some kind of beard, a little peach fuzz maybe, who knows. But on other monasteries in Russia, in Romania, and others, they take kids. Now, they're not allowed to make vows until they've attained to the age of majority, but 18 or 20 or something, whatever it is in that culture. But for example, there were two remarkable elders who actually affected the life in America, the monastic life in America, very, very strongly. And that's Father Roman Braga and his sister, Mother Benedicta. They were 11 and 12 when they joined the monastery, before puberty. And can you imagine what it would be like to be raised in a big monastery where they, without any context of temptations, of external temptations. Now, we can tempt ourselves. We find ways to tempt ourselves, and the monastic fathers are experts in knowing about temptations, both from what they've experienced themselves as well as what they've heard in confession. But think of the kind of purity that they had growing up, and it's just an extraordinary thing. And when a monastery is good and solid and focused, and it has its and it tolerates no corruption of those ideals, it's a system that works. One of the reasons, one of the things that really continually amazes me about Orthodoxy, and one of the reasons I've stayed Orthodox now for 40 years, aside from being a bishop, is that it's a system that works. And that's very fruitful. And I've seen and met people who have been products of that system of spiritual development, and it is a system. And it's remarkable. There are people who have attained to very, very profound spiritual maturity. So that when you get people who've become elders in the faith, and it's on one hand a level of spiritual maturity. It's also an element of charismatic gifting, but it's also a transparency to the grace and activity of God, the grace and activity of the Holy Spirit, that these people become clairvoyant. They can heal. They become vessels, and they conduct, as it were, grace to bring healing, to bring and to give guidance with no personal agendas, because they've been completely purified of personal agenda. So the system is actually most of what is in here. The Ladder of Divine Ascent is one of the foundational books of the monastic life, which illustrates the whole process of working through the passions and working on oneself, working out repentance and coming to that spiritual maturity and dealing with all of the obstacles to spiritual maturity, and dealing with all of the obstacles to life in community and all of these things. It's so funny that the word monk and monastery refer to solitude, and one who lives monastic. A monachos is one who lives alone, but most monasteries are communities, and it's only the people who are the most mature who can live as solitaries, as real solitaries. And there's crazy old guys who go out and are just crotchety old guys who don't like people, but they're not real hermits. They may be all dressed up, and have all of the, but the real elders actually are mostly hidden, and you have to be referred to them, and you have to get a blessing to go and see them, because eldership is not just this coming together of spiritual maturity and charismatic gifting and all of these things, but it's also an act of obedience. And not all people who have attained to that level of maturity, not all who have some of these profound charismatic gifts are able to lead people and to teach people, or it's not ripe yet. They haven't attained yet to the integration of those things, and so it can lead you. They can lead people astray. Unfortunately, there's an elder that I got to know quite well, actually, but he went into delusion. And so he got chased out of Valam, and then he went to Mount Athos, and he got chased out of Mount Athos, and so on and so forth. So, and it's very sad, and he's kind of off by himself, and a holy man. So, what is this process? And this is the whole process of monastic life is essentially encapsulated in the stages of monastic tonsure, in the stages of development, as well as in the various types of institutions that that monasteries, or that embody monasticism. So you get a kid, maybe 18 or 20, 22, which is the best age, by the way, for somebody to go into the monastery. Between 18 and 25, up to 30. After 30, it's hard. After 35, it's like pulling teeth. It's like marriage. After 35, your personality is crystallized, right? And and it's really hard to change, and much less go under obedience. And so monasticism is very tough for people between around 30 to about 60. After 60, you think about it. You've kind of done what you're going to do. You don't have a whole lot of other goals. You may have had a family, and probably the kids are gone, the wife is gone or dead or something like that, or the husband. Either way, it doesn't matter. And you become pliable again. Now, a 22-year-old is going to change a huge amount, because they're going to be able to be they learn, and because that's the nature of being 22. You learn, you change, you grow into a whole identity. If you're 60 or 65 or something like that, you've had an identity, and you're stuck with that identity. But you have a lot of wisdom, and you have a lot of other things that you can bring to a community that most of those kids in their 20s and 30s don't have any concept of, because they have no life experience. So it's a very valuable thing in a community to have people on both ends of the age spectrum. In my monastery in California, we had an 18-year-old come and join us. His parents brought him the day after his graduation from high school. Mm-hmm. And they completely supported his decision. And he's just fantastic. The only problem is he wouldn't walk anywhere. He ran. You're not supposed to run. And try and run and try and run in a cassock. Especially if you're, a tall, skinny kid, with a stride about like that, It was so funny watching some of these guys trying to adapt to a cassock. It's like walking, try putting a belt around your knees. It's not a big deal for women. They kind of have the idea anyway, right? But it's, so 18-year-old, and he's a monk at Platina now, and doing very well, iconographer. On the other hand, we had a couple people in their 70s, 60s and 70s, and there was one guy who had been in the Gurdjieff work. Are you familiar with that? Gurdjieff was a Russian, Caucasus area philosopher, who he was a little on the kind of syncretist. He was New Age in 1920. It was that kind of earliest form of the New Age. He wasn't in the occult movement, because there was a big occult movement at that time, but it was, and so, but he kind of developed this thing which was like a combination of Christianity and Sufism, where they had all of these various kinds of exercises and dances, and whirling around like a Sufi dervish and all of that kind of stuff. Anyway, he died Russian Orthodox. Every year in seminary, since I was one of the few people who could sing a panakida in Slavonic, I got recruited to go down to the 2nd Street Cathedral and sing a panakida for him in Slavonic. And in 1980 or 1982, getting $40 was a big deal. Anyway, he was buried out of the Russian Orthodox Church. So, so this guy had been in that movement for 45 years. In other words, very highly disciplined, very disciplined. Marin County, where we were for 10 years, is one of these places that's like the ultimate mecca of spiritual. There were perennialists, and there were the Gurdjieff people, and actually these groups converted in mass. And the church didn't know quite what to do with them, but some of them became really good people, and they really embraced the faith and the discipline. So we had 18-year-old, we had 75, and everything in between. And that was great, because you can rely on the older guys, for a word of wisdom, and you can rely on the young guys for strong backs. And I tease some guys sometimes that, I did then, I do now. We had enough philosophers, theologians, historians, and intellectuals. Give me a plumber, an auto mechanic, and an electrician. Somebody who can actually do something practical and worthwhile and knows how to work with their hands. So where do the novices come from? Anywhere and everywhere. Like this kid who came. He came out of a very solid, committed Orthodox family. Was raised in the faith, and just his entire life was the church. And so something like that, it's a very easy transition into the monastery. The Abbots in Safford, Arizona, Mother Michaela is a very interesting lady. They have a large school at their monastery. And so they take in all these young women. It's a women's monastery, obviously. And she said the difference between a girl raised in a traditional Orthodox home, especially in the old world, but even here, where their whole life is the church, where the family is together, where the order in the family, the structure of the family, you have the father and the mother, and the kids are in obedience, and they go to church and they say their prayers and all of this. That the transition is so easy for somebody like that, because they have about 7 years greater level of maturity than some kid, who's in a typical American household. There are also people that, the first group of kids that I had were hippies, literally hippies. There's one kid from Vancouver, Washington. He had a VW bus with all sorts of things on the dashboard. Yeah, I don't know if you have that out here. Now this is California, right? Mm-hmm. And he had a little sign on the bus, "Peek out." instead of keep out, it was peek out.
There was one this last Sunday on the highway.
Okay, yeah.
Just like that, with the flowers. And,
oh yeah, yeah.
Signs.
Well, hippiedom never died out in Northern California, and it still has a few places where it's got a foothold. But then there was another kid who came, and he and his brother came out to San Francisco, and they thought they would get in on the whole hippie thing. Well, they got to San Francisco and they saw Haight-Ashbury, which by that time, this is early 90s or mid 90s, and it was, of course, horrible. druggies and and violence and all this, and so they were so disillusioned and disappointed. They went back all the way back to upstate New York, but then the one brother, Daniel, called me up and said, "I'm coming to join your monastery." I said, "Oh, who are you?" It's so funny, but so you get people from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds. Some are well educated. There was another kid who came, and he was 21, and he had been driven into the woods. He had been so brutally abused by his grandfather that he went off from Council Bluffs, Iowa, to the woods of Northern California, and he lived in a redwood tree. It was really quite fun. The story is kind of funny, and because he had a conversion while he was sitting up in that 200 feet up in a redwood tree, and he did a tree sit, which is he spent the winter 200 feet up in the redwood tree so that it wouldn't get cut down. But he had a conversion experience while he was up there. And so he decided, from the stuff he'd been exposed to, that he was Ethiopian Orthodox. Haile Selassie, who was the folk hero at the time, had been Ethiopian Orthodox, and so he was going to be Ethiopian Orthodox. Brian became Baruch. And he got himself, he made a white robe and embroidered it, and then got a brass Ethiopian priest's cross, and started preaching to the hippies on Arcata Plaza in Northern California. And the priest in Eureka, because I'd founded a parish in Eureka, but now they had a full-time priest, and so he was there. And on one level, he was a really straight-laced guy. I mean, just absolutely, kind of immaculate. He was the soccer coach, but really kind of straight-laced, And he was walking by the plaza in Arcata, and he saw, this kid with blonde dreads. He had the best dreads of any white man I ever saw, and he very light blonde, German, and Father John, and there were like 30 hippies around him, listening to him, and he thought, "Oh God, I got to stay away from this guy." Well, who shows up in church the next day? And so Baruch. He was in the back of the church, and of course Father John at the altar, and Father John would come out, and Baruch would bless him back with the cross. Oh yeah, and he informed Father John that he was Ethiopian Orthodox, and that and he wanted to take communion. And Father John asked him, "Are you baptized?" He said, "No." He said, "Well, you can't do that." So he decides, well, this is one for Father Jonah. And so he puts him in the car and brings him down to Point Reyes, 250 miles. It's a long way. And it drops him off. All yours.
I got something for you.
I'll just finish the story. It's a funny story. You can imagine he was pretty out there after having been living by himself in a tree for months and months and processing all of the abuse and all of that. And so I thought, well, if there's anybody who can help straighten him out that he will listen to, it's Abuna Melchizedek. And Abuna Melchizedek was a retired Ethiopian archbishop living in Berkeley that I had met. I taught a class in Berkeley, and so I took him to meet Abuna Melchizedek. And Melchizedek, Abuna was probably 85 at that time, 85. And he had been the Archbishop of Addis Ababa and the abbot of a huge missionary monastery, Ethiopian missionary monastery, and the dean of the Theological Academy, and all of these things. And he'd been thrown in prison when the communists took over because he had been the spiritual father for the imperial family, Haile Selassie and his family. Baruch wasn't a Rastafarian, but influence. He knew that wasn't right. But that was still kind of a tendency. So it took him to see Abuna, and Abuna looks him up and down, and basically says, in a kind of thick accent, he'd say, "Oh, please forgive me. English is my seventh language." He said, "Okay, kid, 4 things. 1, lose the cross. 2, lose the dreads. 3, get baptized. 4, become a novice." I thought, thanks a lot. And he did. He straightened out, and sadly he came to a very kind of sad end. He, being a very impulsive 21-year-old or 22-year-old, he decided to go out rafting on the spring thaw in Class 5 rapids without a helmet and without a life vest, and he drowned. But I know that boy achieved salvation. No question. Anyway, but that's what it's about, isn't it? Bringing people to salvation. And so monastic life, ideally, of course, is this context for developing people to develop their life of repentance. And in Baruch in particular, and all these, what you see is repentance in its truest sense. To be transformed in the renewal of your mind. It's not just changing the context. It's not just, stop sleeping around, not just stop smoking pot, not just, these external things. It's this inner transformation. And that inner transformation is the process of being united to Christ. It's the process of learning to discern the will of God and to do it. Remember what Christ said about his mother. He who is my mother, he who hears the word of God and does it is my brother and my sister and my mother. That's he said about his mother. She, blessed are they who hear the word of God and do it. And that's really what monasticism is all about, nurturing. So on one hand, it has these exceedingly lofty ideals. On the other hand, you're dealing with a bunch of 20-year-olds who are in the midst of trying to work out their identity and what is a relationship with somebody and how do you do that, and all of these questions the 20-year-olds wrestle with, but in a monastic context. Now, in a good monastery, there are no external forms of entertainment. There's no TV. There's no internet. There's no iPods. There's no magazines. There's no TV. There's no movies. There's no nothing. There's the services, and there's work, and a prayer rule. And the idea, especially with young guys, is that you have to keep them busy 16 hours a day. That's a big order. And it means that they have to be physically busy. Now, 4 to 6 plus sometimes hours a day is services, but then some real heavy-duty physical activities and labor is very good. So, for example, we would have the monastery we moved to in Manton, Northern California, had 42 acres of forest. Now, the problem with that property is the water supply is a stream. It's not a well, it's a stream. And it's a stream that's diverted from a bigger stream. And so it's not exactly a well-watered property. In the summertime, it's 110 degrees and 5% humidity. So 105, 110 out there is actually quite pleasant. 95 here is murder, like today, And so one of the tasks that we had, and especially when we would have summer novices, which were college kids basically who would come and spend several weeks in the monastery, and they would get a little bit of special treatment, but for the most part they lived as novices. They were summer novices, but with no commitment. And the big task for them was to thin the forest. Well, that literally saved the monastery when there was a massive fire, right? Yeah. Father Andy, you were there, right? Yeah. Because all of the dead undergrowth was gone. It had been cleared away, and that's what catches and burns. So and even today you can look on Google Earth. Just type in Monastery of St. John of San Francisco in Manton, and it'll take you right to it. You can see this huge complex. And you can see the property line. And on one side of the property line is heavy forest. On the other side, empty land. And that's from a fire. And the fire got to within 12 feet of the building. Something like that. But it saved the buildings. I can describe exactly what we did, which is really not much different than any other monastic community, and I can describe it because, well, I was hand in putting it together. Is that especially once we got to a larger, more developed community, we had a number of tasks that of businesses, because a monastery has to have financial support. And it's fine to be off on a mountaintop someplace, and that's fine if you've got an imperial endowment and things like that. But most monks have to work just like everybody else. Only the idea is to try and develop industries inside the monastery. Now, the first several years of that monastery, I basically supported by serving mission parishes. $250 a weekend or something like that, and that would, and that's what paid for it. Of course, initially we didn't have any rent. It was a diocesan facility. But then, we had to develop our own income, so we started making candles. Then when we moved up to Manton, things just exploded, in the sense that we had not only much more space to deal with, but we had more people. And so there were candles, we made caskets, we made soap, and there was the guest house. Because we had a full guest house with 16 beds and another kind of a couple sheds with another 6 or 8 beds, but boys can, that's fine. 20-year-olds. And it was, and people would make would donate to stay in the guest house. So, and then there was a bookstore, and I was really surprised because even in the first 15 years ago, the bookstore was pulling in $5,000-6,000 a month, which isn't too bad. It isn't too bad. You combine that with the administrative work. So we had basically in monastic administration, you had the abbot. Then you had a guy who was called, in Russian, it's called Благочинный, the person who in charge of the good order. He's kind of like a deputy abbot. And then there's the econom, the steward of the monastery, who's in charge of, he's the CFO, in charge of the finances. And then there's probably a bookkeeper under him. And then there's the head of the bookstore. And then you have another office called a cellarer. And that's the guy who makes sure that everybody has all the stuff that they need. Because if you're going to keep 20 people busy making stuff, you need raw materials. So we would need beeswax, we would need wicking material, we would need, the caskets actually were, the casket business, it's interesting, but it's not quite a kit, but it's like all stuff is all pre-cut. So you need that. You'd need, we also had goats and chickens and ducks and a huge garden. And so then you had to have the people who would process the milk, because there was like 6 goats, and that's a lot of milk a day. That's a lot of milk. And what do you do with all that milk during Lent? And then, if you have 30 chickens, that's a lot of eggs. Now, regular time, that's nothing, I mean, that's a few meals, but, so you have all of this stuff. Then there's the shopping, just keeping, and we were in a location 45 miles from the grocery store. 45 miles from Costco, 45 miles from anything that you really needed. I mean, there were small stores that were very expensive and was useless. So it was a long way out in the wilderness, and so it took time. It took a lot of time. Then, especially for some of the older guys, you had doctor's appointments and all this other stuff. Then in the community, you had a librarian. There were probably, before this one priest got there, we had about 10,000 books in the library. He brought 24,000 books with him. And it was kind of funny because they made the mistake of putting them all on the second floor. Well, the walls bowed. It's California construction, right? Made to withstand earthquakes and things, but not heavy loads. So that didn't work. But with a library that size, that's a lot of work. And it's a lot of work every day. And so then you've got the guy who's in charge of the services. You have an ecclesiarch, in other words, the person who sets up all the services, who also directs the choir. And then you have the sacristan, who cares for the vestments, who cares for all of the, make sure that there's prospera and wine and incense and charcoal and all the stuff that you need for Orthodox liturgy. And then you're in church for 4 to 6 hours a day. So there was plenty of work to keep 20-some people or more busy. And any well-run monastery is like that. You go to West Virginia and you've got the same thing. Actually, you have a lot of the same things. you have goats, you have a garden, you have soap, you have incense, you have what else? Icons being made. What? Candles, of course. And then you have the sacristan, you have the ecclesiarch, you have the cellarer, you have the monastic administration, you have the treasurer, and there's not enough hours in a day. And it's like, here you are in the monastery, and you thought you were going to get away from the hustle and bustle and all the responsibilities in the world. And you just pray, right? Wrong. Wrong. There's a great story of a kid who goes to the monastery. He's very idealistic, and he tells the abbot, "Well, I want to be a monk and I want to pray all the time." The abbot says, "Okay." Takes him to a cell, and so he prays, and he hears people moving around and bells going off and coming around, and then evening comes and people moving around and bells, and he goes out of the cell and goes down to the dining area, the trapeza, and says, "How come you didn't call me for dinner?" The abbot says, "Well, you must be an angel because you want to pray all the time, and therefore you don't have to eat. But if you're a human being like we are, then you have to eat. But since you're an angel, we didn't want to bother you." Yeah. And it's so funny, the ideas that people bring, when they come. We had a very interesting collection of people come. Anyway. So, the first type of monastery today that most people enter is a Koinobion. And I use the Greek term because I prefer it to the Latin. That's the Latin, so it's Koinobion. Or it could be it's with an OE, which you can see is just a transliteration of the Greek. And for the most part, Koinobion means a common life monastery. Koinobion, koinonia, communion, but it also means in common. Bion, bios is life. So it's a common life monastery, and which means that it is it's where everyone holds all things in common. There's a common checkbook. Nobody has their own checkbook. Nobody has their own property. Nobody has their own bank accounts. Nobody has their own investment accounts. Nobody has their own bills. Nobody has their own savings accounts. You get to a certain stage in your monastic life when even if you had all of that stuff, you hand it over to the community. But the Koinobion is the basic school for monastic life. When I entered Vallam Monastery, it was just becoming a Koinobion. The previous abbot had been a bit of a wild man, And the guys that he brought there, because it was the stage in the life of the development of the Russian Church in 1993, when things were just beginning to kind of take root. And so the first abbot, they hadn't even received back the main complex on the island. They received back this ruined monastery in St. Petersburg, where the church had 4 floors put into it. It was turned into a 4-story office building or something, storage unit, whatever. So his great contribution was he redecorated the abbot's quarters. He got very beautiful, fine rosewood furniture, and it's gorgeous. And he had wallpaper made with his initials on it. Can you imagine? And the kind of monastic life that was fostered there was that everybody was doing their own thing. And so he was removed because one of the things that developed there was zealotry. And zealotry, on one hand, there can be a positive side of zeal, but for the most part, it's negative. And so some of the guys there were real zealous. And so they took it upon themselves to throw a Finnish bishop out of the church. Now the Finns loved Valaam, but in their church, which is subject to the Finnish government and the Patriarch of Constantinople, uses the new calendar and the Roman Paschalian. They don't follow the Orthodox date of Pascha; they follow the Roman Catholic date of Pascha, and so it's new calendar, new Paschalian. Churches like the Constantinople and the OCA are new calendar but old Paschalian. And of course, we're old calendar, old Paschalian, the Russian church. They decided that since this bishop was a heretic, they would throw him out. Well, a Finnish bishop is actually an officer of the Finnish state. And so they created an international incident. And so that abbot quickly found himself sitting in a little cell up in the monastery from which he came, deprived of all positions of responsibility because he didn't know how to exercise responsibility. And so my spiritual father came in February of that year. I met him in May and joined in July, but in 1993. But he said when they first got there, and they had received the main complex back, and that's a story in and of itself. But all the monks were sitting at the trapeze, and there were probably 20, 25 people. And there were several of them that were absolutely filthy, and they stank, and they looked like little raccoons, because all you could see was some white around their eyes, and the rest was dirt. and so he asked him, well, why are you so dirty? He said, well, on the holy mountain they never bathed, and so we decided we would do the same because it's truly ascetic, and we want to be real ascetics and real monks. And so he said, in the name of holy obedience, you and you and you and you get to the bath right now. And as an abbot, Saint Seraphim of Sarov had the direction to abbots. You not only have to be a father to your monks, you have to be a mother to your monks. And so sometimes you have to act like mom. and sometimes you need to wield a big stick like dad, and it was really funny when some of the younger monks called me dad. I was kind of like that. Anyway, so Common Life Monastery it's a place in which you have, the whole people of all different ages and many different stages in their monastic life. But it's where novices come in, where they spend their novitiate, where they begin to learn obedience, where they begin to learn the monastic life, where they begin to learn the services and the prayers and the basic disciplines of monastic life. And within the Koinobion, there are usually older, more experienced monks. They may be 5 years older than the novices, or they may be 50 years older. And so the novices are may be assigned to one of these older fathers as a Kellenic, which is like a cell attendant, or as to help him out or to learn from or something like that. But that there's a relationship that develops with so he becomes a father figure essentially. And so then there's the spiritual direction of the monastery is entirely on the abbot. And this is a unique thing, very different than Western monasticism. In Benedictine monasticism, the abbot is forbidden to hear the confessions of the monks. In Orthodox monasticism, the abbot is the spiritual father. He is the elder of the monastery. Whether he's a clairvoyant starets or not is not the point. That he is the senior person in charge, and he is the one who hears the confessions. And obviously, he's got to be spiritually mature and experienced to be in such a position. One of the sad things that's happened in the church is it's taken the monastic ranks and turned them into awards. So if you're a priest monk and you spent so many years, and if you'd been a married priest, you'd become an archpriest, you're made igumen, which means abbot, leader, igumen. And if you've done something really remarkable and then they'll make you an archimandrite. Now, the original meaning of these terms, hieromonk, priest monk, that's obvious. But igumen, that it actually means abbot. And so if you're speaking Greek, you ask for the igumen, you're going to get the head of the monastery. Even though the fathers all call each other Yerunda in Greek, which means elder. So you've got these 20-year-olds calling each other Yerunda, which is kind of funny. It's like the Mormons almost. Elder, right, sure. And then archimandrite. An archimandrite was the dean of monasteries for a whole diocese. So he would have administrative authority over multiple monasteries. Now, in the traditional Orthodox world, a diocese may have 20 or 30 monasteries, just a typical diocese, or more, 50 monasteries. And so being an archimandrite is a big job. And you have to go around and, know all the leadership and, but now it's basically it means bishop candidate, and then you have what in the monastic world we affectionately would call hiero-non-monks. These celibate priests who basically, they're just all dressed up. And one of the things you can always tell, a real monk, for the most part, he never buttons his top button. You can usually tell what he's had for lunch. The cassock is usually frayed. The belt is usually worn. If he's a priest, he probably won't wear the cross that much, and if he does, he probably has one that's kind of beat up that, it's just because he's supposed to, but he's probably totally for real. Whereas these other guys, which we would refer to as the perfumed Archimandrites, they would have, shirts with French cuffs and expensive, cuff links, and it would be just perfect, and they always have their top button buttoned, and their cassocks had always just come back from the cleaners, and they always had some fine cologne on their hands, and you wouldn't want to, you drop your keys around, you'd want to flee from these people, because there's nothing monastic about them. And some of them had never even darkened the doors of a monastery. And if they had, they wouldn't have lasted 20 minutes. Partly because they would have been teased so bitterly that they couldn't deal with it, because their egos are so overbloated, and so this one of the things you get you get in the church is you get all sorts of things, and you see some of the abuses. Now, I never saw most of the abuses, honestly. I had my boss, Father Bishop Nikolai, and Father Ian in Sacramento, who were my bosses for, in general, would not have thought that I had my nose to the grindstone in the monastery, because I was, doing this missionary work and traveling and giving lectures and talks and things like that, and which is partly supporting the monastery, but they didn't understand that. But, for example, I had absolutely no clue what I was getting myself into when I became the Metropolitan of the OCA. I had no clue, because when I was in that monastery, which is way up it's in the Cascade. Actually, we were on Mount Lassen. Mount Lassen is in the Cascades. It's not even it's north of the Sierras. That's it's 250 miles north of San Francisco, which is like 250 miles from civilization, right? Well, Reading is kind of kind of not. And I didn't really know what was, I kind of knew what was going on the other side of the Sierras. I knew that there was life on the other side of the Rockies, but I had no clue what was going on in the Far East, like New York. No clue. And I couldn't care less, because it didn't affect my life, it didn't affect my ministry, and I had to focus on, what affected my ministry and what affected my people and all of that kind of stuff. And all of that was far, far away. And in monastic life, that becomes kind of you basically are focused on your little world there. And now, as being who I am, and doing all these lectures and teaching, and I had a kind of broader picture than most of the monks in the monastery, but it was still fairly small. And so, unfortunately, well, I won't even go there. So your whole life, when you're in a community like that, and it doesn't matter whether it was Manton, 20 years ago, or whether it was, whether it's Mount Athos or Sinai or Valam or any of the now 1,000 monasteries in Russia, or Romania or Serbia or Greece or wherever, the The fathers are focused on their life there. And they may, monks, for example, will, they'll hear little bits and pieces. They don't watch the news. They don't hear the news. They're not listening to the radio. They're not looking. There's no internet in a well-run monastery. There's no sources of. There's no newspapers. There's no magazines. There's none of that nonsense. So, what do you focus on? Your brothers. Your brothers. And so, one of the things that Father Sophrony of Essex had or St. Silouan had a saying, "My brother is my life." Now, in our monastery, we wanted to make a T-shirt, and we had a T-shirt actually, "My brother is my life." But some of the brothers would say, "Yes, my brother is my wife." Nag, 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 nag. And so, now, I was also the spiritual father for a women's monastery for 4 years. And in fact, actually before I started in Point Reyes. 2 years before I started in Point Reyes. And it's the same. Except women are much nastier to one another than men are. That's really tough. But it's all the same. All the issues are basically the same. And I've had very broad experience in the Orthodox monastic world. On Mount Athos in Russia, Mount Athos in Russia, primarily. It's all the same. All facing the same issues. Sit down with the Abbots, and I was honored because I was received as one of them. It's like, here are these great fathers. Who am I, to be in their midst? But it's all the same stuff. And so your care is how do you pastorally care for your monks? Now, so you've got these guys who are working their tails off. They're busy 16 hours a day. And God help you if they're not busy 16 hours a day, because it becomes a disaster. Idle hands are the devil's plaything. Absolutely, 100%. And so I described what some of the tasks that they were doing. Now, what the abbot does, and there's a lot of that in here, is to hear the thoughts. Now, you develop a monastic administration, and by the time you have 10 or 12 guys, that all works. And St. Benedict said that 12 is the ideal size for a community. And I understand that, because you can know what's going on with everybody in detail. Whereas it gets larger than that, it becomes, people kind of fall through the cracks. Yeah.
At one point, like say Ebelan, the Bishop of Krakow, does he still hear every single confession, or does he have other trusted priests that are hearing confession?
He has people that he has developed who are priest monks that hear the confessions, but they come to him.
Okay.
And so there's a monastic council. In a Koinobion, it's run by a monastic by 2 or 3 levels of councils. One, there's the kind of Abbots immediate administrative council. It's the abbot, the deputy abbot, or the dean, or blagacini, whatever you want to call them, and the econom. And they make the kind of day-to-day decisions. Then there's another level of, in other words, what to buy, what people need to do, all this kind of day-to-day stuff. Then there's another level of council, which is the meeting of all of the senior, in other words, all of the tonsured monks. And so some council like that would make the decision as to whether to accept somebody into the tonsure, or whether they should remain a novice, or whether to kick them out. All of these kind of things. And then all really major economic decisions would be referred to the larger council. But the smaller decisions, I think it was up to $5,000 or something like that, would be the Abbots council. Even 15 years ago, it took over $250,000 a year to run that place. But with 25 guys, 25 people and $250,000, it's not, over a whole year, that's not a lot of money. Not a lot of money. I calculated it usually cost about $1,500 a month per person. So, anyway, so you've got the administration and the decision making. Then there's another kind of a council, which is the spiritual council, which would be the senior priest monks and the abbot. And the abbot is the spiritual father of the monastery. If the monastery is less than 15 or 20, then the abbot can hear all the confessions. And especially with novices, you want to hear their thoughts at least daily, sometimes more often, sometimes a couple times a day. With the senior guys, they'll come when they need to, but at least once a week for an hour or so. So that's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of counseling. And it's counseling, it's spiritual direction, it's all this kind of thing. And within that, there are decisions of when people move to different levels of commitment to the community. And and monastic life is structured by, like everything else in the Orthodox Church, it's a level of seniority. Not only from the day that one enters the community, but from the time one is received into these various ranks. So the first thing you start out as a visitor or a worker. A worker may be somebody actually who's paid by the monastery to help out, or is donating his time, but he's basically just a layman who's living in the monastery, and that's it. I mean, comes and goes, and and if he's really serious, will come to all the services and will take part in the life of the monastery. These are the guys that are really seeking a vocation in the monastic life. Then the next level would be a postulant, and the worker and postulant can kind of flow into one another. And some postulants don't live in the monastery, they're still in the world, paying off their debts. Ideally, you come to the monastery with no debt. So this is a big problem with school debt. It's a huge problem. You come without any obligations. There's no child support, there's no alimony, there's no nothing that you have to look. You have to come free. And actually, for most guys, they're very happy to be totally free of those kinds of responsibilities. So after a certain time, a person is received as a novice. And novitiate means that they're clothed in a cassock and a belt and a hat, a little skufia. But they don't wear any other monastic clothes. They still own their own property. They still have their own bank accounts and all of that stuff. Hopefully it's in kind of dormant mode so they don't have to worry about it, but there's, and they still have to pay for their own health care, all of that kind of stuff. And novitiate should last a minimum of 3 years. At the time, well, there's some debate in the monastic world how long a novitiate should last. Some places it's 7 to 10 years as a novice. Others, for example, in the Russian tradition, they consider the next rank of rasophore to be basically a glorified novice. But the novitiate there's tremendous freedom on one hand, and yet it's not because there are no vows, there's no commitment made. A novice is free to leave. Platina had stories of finding people's cassocks hanging up in the outhouse, So I don't remember that we had any of that. People would get a blessing to leave if they wanted to. But the novices were there, and in Russian, the word for novice is poslushnik. This is obedience in Russian. So a novice is actually an obedientiary, if you want a Latin term. Somebody who's under obedience. And for those who have an authentic zeal for it, it's a great time because it's a completely a free will offering of their time and of their work and all of this kind of thing. And the expectations are that they will be at all the services, they will confess their thoughts, and they will be under obedience to the abbot and to all the senior monks. And now there's a basic rule of obedience that if you're told to do anything illegal, immoral, or fattening, you're bound to disobey. But you can never, nobody can ever be told to do anything illegal or immoral. And if they are, then there's a big problem, and that should get reported. So the novices, it's a time of learning. Then comes rasophore. And there's no, actually the prayer that's read for a rasophore, when they become a rasophore, is the prayer of receiving a novice. It's in the ancient church. It's basically a short prayer. We thank God for that you have delivered this person from the world and have brought him here and grant him your grace to do your will and that kind of thing. And he receives a tonsure, but it's the tonsure like the tonsure of a reader. It's not sacramental. Just like a reader's tonsure is not sacramental. But it's a kind of a pledge. And a rasophore is under a moral obligation to live according to the monastic rule. A novice is also under a moral obligation, takes on the moral obligation to live according to the monastic rule. But rasophore, it's more serious. And the way that, and so what they are is there's stages in not only in maturity, but also in commitment to the community. Because ultimately, you're married to the community, in a sense. So this may be 3 years, 2 to 3 years. Rasophore, it can be your whole life, but another 2 to 3 years. And then comes small schema, or schema, or mantia. Or full monk. And so this is after 5 to 10 years after entrance into the monastery. And the schema, the small schema, is this. And then there's a rectangle on the back. Looks like this. And it has the cross, the skull of Adam, and the ladder, and the pillar with the rooster on it that crowed when Peter. And it says around, I bear on my body the marks of the Lord Jesus.
Is the ladder the ladder of divine ascent? Or?
No, the ladder is the ladder that they used to take Jesus down from the cross. In other words, it's the instruments of the passion. The cross, the spear, the sponge, the nails, the crown of thorns, all of that. And the schema, or mantia is a cape. It's a big cape, and it has 33 pleats for 33 years of the life of Jesus. And it's the garment that's given to somebody who has attained to that level of monastic life. The raso is given to a rasophore, and I don't know what it was initially or early on, because that particular garment is late Byzantine, and it's the robe of an imam, actually. So, all priests are supposed to wear rasos, all monks are supposed to wear rasos. You see a monk out in public, and you should have a raso on. A priest is supposed to, technically I'm in my underwear. This is the underwear. But the raso is the garment with the long sleeves, and it's from the Byzantine Empire, but it was the robe of an imam that was given to that they made the Christians wear it, so as a kind of mark that they're sanctified people. Schema, you take full vows, and poverty, chastity, obedience. In other words, non-acquisition, chastity. In other words, virgin celibacy, and obedience, and stability. Non-acquisitiveness, no stuff, no possessions. Chastity, it's not only no sex, no family, but it's also, the word means integrity. In Russian, the Russian word means fullness of, or wholeness of wisdom, celomudria. Obedience is obedience, cutting off of one's own will. And stability means that you vow to stay in the monastic life until your death, and to stay in the monastery in which you are tonsured until your death. So, unless you're sent someplace else. So, this is very serious. Now, there are 2 levels of schema, and in the Russian church, there's great schema, and that is usually given after a monk has been in the small schema for 25 years or more, and it means that they're most likely going to retire to a hermitage. And the service is basically just a renewal of the vows from the small schema. The Greeks generally only give the schema, or the great schema, but the Russians treat the great schema like the Russian small schema. So there's different practices in different places. But what it is, it's a discernment on the part of the abbot of a person's commitment to Christ and commitment to the spiritual life, to the monastic life, of their commitment to the community. One of the things I always looked for was if a person had a sense of responsibility for the whole community. They weren't just it wasn't just that they were concerned with their own little area of responsibility and wouldn't do anything to help anybody else. What's that? But rather the guy who would finish his work and then go find somebody else to help. That's somebody who has a sense of responsibility, who would pick up a piece of trash that was laying on the ground, and a sense of responsibility for the whole, because of course that's a very mature sense of that's maturity, and all of these are contexts for people to grow into spiritual life. Now, if I can I'll go to 9. If you don't mind, I'll go to 9. The Mount Sinai Monastery is a Koinobion with the same structure. Now, one of the differences is it was an imperial foundation, which meant it had an endowment. And in Russia, a lot of the traditional areas of the Orthodox world, Mount Athos, the monasteries had endowments. And so, for example, in Russia, there was a huge controversy between the possessors and the non-possessors. Now, there was the non-possessors were people like Saint Neil of Sora, who was an Athonite monk who brought Athonite spirituality back to Russia in the early 16th, late 15th, early 16th century, and he lived it was a community of hermits, and they literally possessed almost nothing. Even the chalice they used for the liturgy was made out of wood. No jewels, no gold, no silver, no vessels, they had icons, but they were simple, and there was no riches, none of the wealth. Now, if you go to some of the great monasteries in Russia, they're just lavish displays of incredible amounts of wealth, and some of it very old. The monasteries were endowed over the course. Some of the monasteries were endowed over the course of centuries, not only with money and with rich possessions, but with land. And up until 1863, that land had peasants attached to it called serfs. And so the monasteries became the lords of these huge amounts of territory. More than a third of Russia was owned by the monasteries. And dozens of villages of serfs who were tied to the land by law. And so actually the serfs liked to be under monastic masters because they were generally very kind and generous, whereas the secular ones tended to be nasty and mean. You didn't have the thing in with serfdom where they would sell the children and things like that, or sell, partners. I mean, the families were tied to the land, so it was different than American slavery. But there was still no freedom, and there was this heritage of the serfs would have these properties that they would care for, and they would have to yield a portion of the fruit of the land of their labors to the monastery. Now the monasteries in turn not only sold the produce, but they also kept huge storehouses, so that if there was a famine, the people would go to the monasteries and would be fed, and would be able to make it through the famine. Whereas in the areas without monasteries, on the site, they were just up the creek. So there were benefits within that system at that time to monastic ownership of land. But on the whole, what it did was it created, these pockets of immense wealth. If you go to Optina, you go to, not Valam, because Valam was stripped. You go to Skov Caves, and you walk into the Abbots' quarters, and it's just like 18th century treasure house. There's amber, vessels, and gold and silver, and fine art, and all this stuff were gifts over the course of the centuries. And so that was a very odd thing, because most of the monks, lived in their cells. They would have a few books. They would have their icons, and some of them had nice icon corners, lots and lots and lots, and a couple cassocks, a couple change of shoes and boots, and underwear, and that's it. And most of them didn't want any more. And so, there were issues with this immense amount of wealth that was given to the monasteries. Now, the great temptation, though, for monks is books. Remember I talked about how the library at Manton started out with 10,000 volumes? Most of it was mine, actually, about 8,000 volumes of it. And then this Father Stavros brings 24,000 plus CDs and DVDs. Huge. It was a full semi-truck. And it was so heavy that you couldn't stack multiple layers in the truck of boxes because the semi-truck couldn't handle it. So the books.
Books are heavy.
Books are very heavy.
I can say.
In Sinai has, this exquisite collection, and it's the greatest ancient library in the world for Greek texts and Syriac texts. Stuff that they don't even know what's in there, some of it. And there's other monastic libraries that were, just amazing. So this is all of this stuff, even the funny stories about some of the people, is what you're going to encounter in this. Only this was written around the year 600. And they had their equivalent of hippies, and they had their equivalent of, the old guys coming in and the new kids coming in and all of this stuff. People struggling with obedience, trying to figure that out, trying to figure out, how do you deal with your passions? And it confronts all of it, and so it's a very important text. So, questions?
Was it written for monastics exclusively?
Yes.
Was it written, okay.
That was the intention. Of course, right, presently, it's read very broadly. It's even been translated into Chinese recently. There are things that are not applicable to people living in the world, but there are things that are very applicable to people living in the world. And so you just have to kind of sort through that. But that monastic life, which basically has been the same for the past 1,700 years, is what you find in there. It's what you find in Holy Cross in West Virginia. It's what you find on Mount Athos. It's what you find at Sinai now. There are problems. There are corruptions of it. There, as always, any human community. But on the whole, you have to deal with it all. What else, please?
Is there like a equivalent in Orthodoxy of the monastic orders like they have in Catholicism
No.
that are for helping people going out, special missions and doing things in the world to help the poor and all that?
Well, in Catholic terminology, it's the distinction between active life and contemplative life. So groups like the Cistercians and the Trappists and the they make in France, what is it? Integrate silence. What is it? Cluny. Well, not Cluny. Anyway, there are these. What's that? Carthusians. There are these radical or radical monastic communities, and they're not orders per se. Actually, they're monasteries. Monasteries are not orders, because each monastery, even though there are kind of federations of monasteries where they may have a common rule, like the rule of Saint Benedict between them, and an interpretation, like the Cistercians or the Trappists, are all interpretations of the rule of Saint Benedict. Each monastery is whole in and of itself. Then they have priories and other kinds of associated institutions, which in the Orthodox world would be called sketes, or dependencies, podvorias, or metochia. The orders came in with, and then there were active life monasteries. And initially, like when St. Basil wrote his rule, he was writing to active life. What he preferred were the active life monasteries, where they had hospitals and schools and hospices and all, these active social works. the monastics would live in community, and yet their work was, this social work basically. And St. Basil didn't like the solitary life. He thought it was selfish. And he has passages in his work where he just excoriates the solitary life. He just thinks it's the worst thing. But in the Middle Ages, you had a number of communities arise, which are, on one hand, there's a monastic element. So Dominicans, the Franciscans are the two main ones. The Dominicans arose in the universities. In particular, the Franciscans were initially focused on ministry to the poor. And then over the course of the second millennium, because these all started after the turn of the millennium, it just mushroomed into literally hundreds of different orders, each with their own particular apostolate, as they call it, and each with their own kind of vocation, each following the teaching of their founder. So obviously Francis inspired the Franciscans, Dominic inspired the Dominicans, but then you have the Jesuits and Francis Xavier, and then all these hundreds, Mother Elizabeth Ann Seton, and everywhere in the world these Catholic orders, or like a fantastic one is the Little Sisters of the Poor. That's 18th century French. But the sisters live an extremely ascetic life. They have one or two changes of clothes, and that's it. Maybe an icon or a cross and a couple books, and literally nothing else. So that they can be transferred and be ready within 20 minutes to be transferred across the world someplace. And that's the vocation of these particular, and these are they're structured on a worldwide or a nationwide. They have provinces and all of this kind of stuff. There's a mother house someplace now in Rome for the most part, but there's local authority structure, but all the major questions go through the center. And what that was is it enabled them to organize their ministry in a very broad way, so that there's a kind of niche that they could fulfill in many different places. And some of them were missionaries, and some of them were hospices, and some of them, for servants of the poor. And then you have the Jesuits, which are something else. And so that never developed in the Orthodox Church. Each house is its own thing. Although, for example, you take Vallam Monastery, and you've got the main complex, Holy Transfiguration Monastery, and the church is Holy Transfiguration, and it has 17 satellites, skeets on the islands of this archipelago. Then it has 7 urban podvorias, dependencies, which take care of the economic life of the monastery and its relationship to the greater society. So, in St. Petersburg or Moscow, if a monk gets sick and he needs to go to the doctor in the big city, he goes there, he stays there until he, they need to buy a new fleet of tractors or a new fleet of boats. Father Seraphim Rose said that novices and cars are the plague of monasteries. In Valam, it's novices and boats. So, you know, I mean, or to sell the products of the monastery, all of this stuff. And it's interesting. The Athonite monasteries had the same thing. Saint Silouan was the econom, the steward, of one of the Podvorias, or Metochia, of Saint Pantaleon's monastery. And so he lived in that place, which was remote from Mount Athos, for a while, and you know, worked there as the financial coordinator, managing the people. Then I don't know how you would categorize this, but one of the great monasteries on Mount Athos actually owns the McDonald's franchise in Thessalonica. If you'd call that a Metochian, I don't know. But that's where you can go there and get a McLent burger. Yeah.
Wasn't the active versus the contemplative part of the polemic about the possessors versus the non-possessors?
No, because all the in Orthodoxy, all the monasteries are mixed, contemplative and active. And there are some people that live the more active ministry, and some are more contemplative, and it's usually a balance between the two.
It just seemed like a lot of the writings about it, St. Joseph and such, suggested how the possessors provided all this for the people, hospitals and everything else.
Which they did.
And of course, St. Neil, no, we're just going to stay here.
Right. Well, that's pretty much, and this is where you encounter the difference between a Koinobion and a skete. And what St. Neil had was a skete. What St. Joseph Wolodzki had was a Koinobion. So St. Neil lived with a bunch of monks in, you know, individual cells, and, you know, I think there may have been a palisade or something around it, but, you know, and a common church, but it was not community life. Of course, it was in the middle of the Russian wilderness in the 15th or 16th century, so it wasn't exactly, you know, it wasn't exactly urban. Whereas Koinobion, it can be in the middle of a city. One of the largest Koinobia that ever existed is the Studion Monastery in Constantinople, and it had 8,000 monks. It occupied an entire city block. Now it's in ruins now, but huge. It's a huge community, and in the middle of the city. Studion, like St. Theodore the Studite. And that's where a large part of our liturgical life comes from. They worked it out. Whereas then you've got some place like St. Savas Monastery in Jerusalem, which is carved into the side of a canyon, or an arroyo, we would say in the West. And that's a remote, isolated, or was a remote, isolated, contemplative community. They still had some kind of ministry, outreach ministry, but it was mostly contemplative, and so and you do have these, but the Athonite monasteries, for example, on Athos there are 20 major monasteries, and the abbots of that are the Holy Community. And they make all the decisions for Mount Athos, which is an independent state. And then there are hundreds of sketes and hermitages, some with 1 or 2 people, some with 10 or 20, some with 40 or 50, and there was one that had hundreds, a Russian skete now under the Greeks, St. Elias, and
St. Anne's is big also.
Skete of St. Anne, yeah. You know, these were huge institutions, and you know, and so you had, you know, a great diversity of ministries within. But on Mount Athos, all the major monasteries are compelled by law to offer hospitality for 3 days to whoever comes for free, room and board. So you go to a place like Vadapeti or the Russian monastery or some of these other places, and they'll have 300 people a day, if you can imagine. 300 people a day. Could you imagine feeding 300 people, visitors a day, that aren't contributing?
I'd rather go to Dionysia.
Well, Dionisio is one of them too, but they just have smaller facilities. Yeah.
How does non-possession apply to you mentioned bank accounts, but what about things that, for example, email accounts, social media accounts?
No social media. It's just not. Now there may be 1 or 2 people in the monastery to maintain a Facebook account or a website or something like that, but that's not personal. It's, in other words, all the money is held in common, and if you have a need, you go to the abbot and say, I need to get some undershirts, and he'll tell you to go to the cellar and don't bother me with that. If you need underwear, go to the cellar and he'll either pull them out of the storage locker or go and buy them for what you need, or give you the car keys and say, be back by Vespers, and a check or cash for what you need. And so that's how that works. But all the bills are paid. Nobody has cell phones. There'll be 1 or 2 cell phones in the monastery for the use of. There may be, like St. Anthony's, it has a network of cell phones, but it's an internal network. It's not an external network. And so, for example, the guest master and the bookstore manager have cell phones with outside, and probably the abbot and a couple, senior monks. But of the 50 monks there, nobody has a cell phone. Nobody has any of that kind of stuff because they're there all the time. And if you've got a bunch of guys who are sent out to, I don't know, clear a patch in the desert, which is, they'll have a cell phone with them because if somebody gets bit by a rattlesnake, then they probably need help as soon as possible. But otherwise, it's so.
Are there any that follow the old Optina system of eldership?
Oh yeah, there are. That's a topic for next week.
Okay.
Because largely what this talks about is eldership, and you have.
Because it was different than what you talked about. Because Elder Moses was the abbot, his brother Anthony ran the newly built skeep, but then when Elder Leonid came, he became the elder.
Well, that what they did at Optina was one thing. How it's normally done in other places is a little different. But every monastery has its own variations, and it depends on who God gives at that particular. So hope you found this interesting. It's kind of fun to share some of my own experience, but it's instructive because it's literally no different any place on earth, regardless of the culture and all of that. So, but it's bad news when you get monks, when you mix monks with cell phones and social media and internet and all of that kind of stuff. They have the same problems as any other group of men. There are 2 competing cell phone companies on the Holy Mountain, if you can imagine. So, okay.
Bless the most good Mother of God, and marvel and mature and more worthy on the presence of God without question, gives spread the God of word, and not truth, He will talk so magnify. Glory to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and to ages of ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy.
God is with us through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, into ages of ages.
Amen.
He's